Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to just briefly introduce myself. I'm Benjamin Prosky. I'm the Assistant Dean for Communications at the GSD and just started here this summer. Looking forward to get to know a lot of you. And I am really pleased to have this as part of our program. And I won't talk long. Before I hand the program over to Professor Krzysztof Wodiczko, who is from the GSD's own program in art design and public domain, who really put together this evening, I'd like to ask our friend Homi Bhabha, who is a professor here at Harvard and of course director of the Mahindra Center for the Humanities, and also asked by the university to pull together a series of events to commemorate 9/11, including the really wonderful and touching observance that was last Sunday. Some of you might have caught in Sanders Auditorium. So Professor Bhabha, thank you.
Thank you very much. I won't take up much of your time, but I have been treated always enormously generously by the design school, so thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I feel a little guilty that I have, for reasons not in my control, poached a little bit on your area and have done something which is not half as elegant as something that you would have done. But in June, when the president asked me to organize an event, which I did last Sunday on the observance of 9/11, I thought that we needed more than simply an evening or a day. And at that point, never having built anything in my life or designed anything of any lasting value, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we created a 9/11 walk across the campus? And due to restricted financial resources, we couldn't do it right across the campus. But if you go to the Barker Center, you will find what we call now poetry posts. We chose 8 poems and 8 posts that stretch from the Barker Center right through the yard. They go diagonally across. Each one carries the names of Harvard alums who perished on 9/11, and each one carries a poem, some of them written explicitly about the event, and some like Auden, September 1st, 1939, of course, written for completely different circumstances, but again, a date of some importance, and the September itself resonates, but a poem that was very much in demand and in circulation, public libraries, public schools after 9/11. There's Emily Dickinson, but then there are a number of contemporary poems too. So if you have a moment, if you go to the Barker Center and just find your way then past the past the Henry Moore and on towards the President's office, you will see a trail of poetry posts. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I just wanted to make sure that you might, if you had a moment, take that walk. Thank you.
Good evening. The context of the recent September 11 commemoration, the opening of the World Trade Center Memorial, as well as memorials in other US cities, ask for analytical and critical reflection and design imagination regarding the past, the present, and the future of memorials. The word memorial or monument is an important thing to bring back here to our discussion. The monument in Latin derives from the verb moneo, monitum, that is to remind, to warn with regard to future conduct of events. The word memorial refers to memento, that is precisely command, to mind, beware, or to remind. It also refers to monitor, the one who reminds, admonishes, or checks, from monere, to admonish, warn, and advise. How is it possible, would it be possible to see memorial function as this kind of warning, admonishing thing, device, event? In what way it could create a dynamic or inspire discursive, critical dialogue with the past towards the better future? I'm thinking about this, and also on the basis of my own experience, of my own work, and I work with people on my projects. I think that for larger social commemorative projects, we can learn a great deal from individuals and groups who, in order to survive their own survival and to survive the survival of their closest, who would become memorials themselves, the living monuments to their own trauma, as Judith Herman called them. They do warn, admonish, advise, indeed. To heal themselves, they strive to develop their own capacity to express their emotions, speaking in public, elaborating their loss, testifying to the wrong, to the unspeakable. They become philosophers, judges, theologians, testimonial and interventionist artists. They present the present-day parrhesiastes, the free speakers, as democratic agents. For them, the memory is an action of telling their story, conveying, exchanging, confronting with others the truth of their experience, critical vision of the future. Doing so, they may challenge the melancholic silence of built memorials and demonstrate even there, on their grounds, the truth of their counter-memory. But what about monuments, memorials that face the larger social trauma, cultural trauma, traumatized nations, traumatized cultures? How to disrupt the melancholic memory as connected to the process of acting out, which Dominique Lacapra described after Freud as related to repetition, even repetition compulsion, the tendency to repeat something compulsively. This is very clear in the case of people who undergo trauma. They have tendency to relive the past, to exist in the present, as if they were still fully in the past, with no distance from it. With such melancholy, how then do you affirm a democratic politics? What are the mechanisms for bringing about agency that would enable people to engage in civil society? Ask Lacapra. Political activity, any form of social agency. In proactive memory connected to the process of working through, speaking like Freud, the person tries to gain critical distance on a problem to be able to distinguish between past, present, and the future. Joe Hill, a labor movement organizer, sentenced unjustly to death in 1915, wrote days before execution to hundreds of thousands of his supporters, "Do not waste time mourning. Organize." Hence the labor slogan, "Do not mourn, organize." In fact, it means do not waste time acting out, locked in the melancholic state about my murder. Mourn instead through organizing. Build my memorial building better world in which there will be no room for the injustice done to me. That's what he had in mind. So how the memorials can act against collective repression that prevents the deformations of national character and social structures that facilitated a pathological course of development from coming to light. How to prevent it, how to act against the process of preventing it from coming to light allowing instead those abnormalities remain buried deep within the recess of the collective psyche, from which they may emerge at some later date in historically altered form. Someone said that our era is not a postmodern era. Instead, it is post-traumatic condition. Well, if that's the case, then the question still remains, how are we going to respond to such expectations? Freud spoke of mourning as translating, tropping, and figuring. The question is whether memorials already built or about to be built provide conditions for healthy process of such translation, tropping, and figuring, or of loss, combined with doing as a way to pave the ground for a world to live and be better, as a place which aids our ability to deal with post-traumatic human conditions. Or do they constitute the example of fetishism? And that's a way for us to avoid dealing with trauma in meaningful and effective ways. In the words of La Capra, operating as narrative fetishism, or worse, premature closure. Continuing discussion of new memorials, counter-monuments, temporary memorials demands renewed historical, theoretical, design, artistic discussion on the aim, function, form, commemorative program, methodology, and techniques of a memorial. Can we design new and redesign old memorials to provide democratic conditions for memory discourse and inspiring programs for proactive engagement in building better future on which next generation will have less tragic events to commemorate and less memorials to be built? Well, with this question, I will end my introduction. And I would like to introduce the first speaker, Professor Mark Jarzombek, a professor of history, theory, and criticism, Associate Dean, School of Architecture and Planning. He has taught at MIT since 1995 and has worked on a range of historical topics from Renaissance to the modern, work extensively on 19th and 20th century aesthetics. His first book was on Leon Battista Alberti. His second book, The Psychologizing of Modernity, Art, Architecture, and History, was published at Cambridge University Press in 2000. He received PhD from MIT in 1986. He was postdoctoral resident fellow in the Getty Center for the History of Humanities and Art, fellow in Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, and fellow of Canadian Center for Architecture. Just published a textbook entitled Global History. Welcome.
I'll put you out of your misery.
You've been always very helpful. Thank you.
Krzysztof, thank you for the invitation to speak to you guys tonight. Look forward to the discussion afterwards. And let's see if I could have my little PowerPoint going. Okay, there we go. Okay, all right, good. Gosh, it's so big up there. Well, I think Krzysztof's little introduction got us really going. And I think this will add a dimension. I think all our conversations looking ahead will sort of put an X, Y, Z and a Q factor into all this that we can sort of unpack a little bit later. Well, when we talk about memorials, we often, assume that somehow it's a question of the design, compatibility, the politics that go into it, as if we sort of know the event that we're memorializing, but the question is what is in fact the memorial itself. It stands as an open question, but memorials are always an operative thing. They project something into that which is potentially missing in public discourse. So I want to keep that just as sort of a placeholder and shift the discussion to from below. And I mean from below, literally from the question of death, from below the earth. So death has changed considerably in the last decades, and 9/11 has escalated these terms, that's for sure. Basically, I'm saying that death is not what it used to be. But first to the question of trauma, since Krzysztof has raised that. And we still attach to it a principle that a trauma is a wound, that the idea is something bad and negative. Let me just... but trauma since 9/11 has become also something else. It's become a cultural trope of the first order. And as such, it, more than anything else, has changed the terms of death making. So note that this is November 4, so a few months after 9/11, the Boston Globe can already make fun of the New York guys as being traumatized because they lost a baseball match. So it just shows how quickly, you know, we can sort of transcend sort of the deep horror of trauma, right, and use the word in basically our everyday conversation almost, right, to describe football, baseball, basketball. What is it? Baseball, guys? All right. Whatever. Now, in the conventional terms of death-making, we associate it, therefore, with the face of terror. And of course, needless to say, we know what that face sort of looks like. But I want to point out another face of terror that's even worse, very much more terrible. It blows things up. It does terrible things. It's hateful, and it's destructive. And you haven't seen it, and I know you haven't seen it. I'm sort of hoping, I'm crossing my fingers here, because you're not a father in 9/11 with a 5-year-old son. And so what is this face of terror? Now, this face of terror came out a few months before 9/11, and of course it was discreetly retracted afterwards. But it shows that already well before 9/11, death-making had reached a new level. I don't know, low or high. Now, in my days, when we were kids, you know, we had cops and robbers and Indians and cowboys and GI Joes and Nazis, and these type of things. But now we have terrorists and what, right? So the terrorist really isn't paired off with anything. It's just terrorists and the world or the universe. There is no duality of good and evil. There is just one force in town, and that is the force of terror that my 5-year-old was playing with. And that kids are expected to normalize and naturalize. It is a sublime force par excellence, right? Because there's no resistance, right? And it's fully armed and loaded, and of course, cute. So it's even better than, you know, Osama, who's certainly not cute. So shockingly, the face of terror was even recently reintroduced. It disappeared from Pokemon, and then was recently reintroduced. So not in Japan, but in other places around the world as the storm of terror, which is sort of ironic, of course, because this happened after the tsunami in Japan. So the Japanese are really sort of, you know, marketing their anguish in a really interesting way. So the problem with terror is not that it's sort of out there, it's not that it has a face, it's sort of in us, in our culture, in sort of the pop world, and it is a plaything. It is something that we play with. So terrorism is, to just put it all too bluntly here, a concept shifting signifier, and basically I would say a postmodernist concept in that sense. So after 9/11, we can sort of do this, which is sort of this astonishing advertisement that was taken out by Chevron, showing us in a SUV just right after the bomb blast. And we see you turn on your windshield wiper, you know, you survive somehow, right? You turn on your windshield wiper and you wipe off the dust from the terrorist attack, and you look up and you see the bank still there going, thank God. You know, all right. So that's what we can do. I mean, we can just wipe off the dust of terror, and we can satisfy ourselves that life goes on and that capitalism has survived. And of course, we can sort of produce some desire to exalt the new historicism of America, the ethos of national unity, and I think a good deal of the sort of bizarre political situation in which we live today is grounded in this sort of moment. And of course, we can make all sorts of bombastic memorials to sort of satisfy bombastic needs. But what 9/11 sort of also brought out, or brought into the open, was sort of the residual question of death making that lurks within the social fabric. And, literally in the New York Times, if you go before 9/11 and you say how many advertisements basically, pull out the question of our psychic distress, you would have, I think it was like one a month, and afterwards it was literally every day. Now, we can sort of poo-poo this and do what New York Times did, is pretend that we can go to Dr. Dog. But of course, we know that's pretty silly. And we also know that, of course, this is a serious business, and that there's a sort of a psychological and psychiatric industry behind this that is sort of taking this all very seriously. The irony, of course, is that humans have been killing each other for 1.5 million years. I mean, assuming that's how long we've been around as humans. But it was only in really 1982 that post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized as a medical condition. And even then, it was only reserved for Vietnam War veterans. And only grudgingly did the psychiatric profession allow women who had been raped or so-called civilians to be sufferers of PTSD. So it's a sort of astonishing sort of moment in the history of humanity, where after 1 million years we finally sort of actually diagnosed the consequences of the crap that we do to each other. So the irony is double, because not only have we sort of, in some sense, opened it up, there's no turning back. And now it's sort of everywhere. And this, of course, is sort of lurking behind all of course, this is $1 billion of industry having to do with solving the problem. So this is just the amount of profits made by the pharmaceuticals in curing trauma. So we see in 2001, it hardly registered as an economic force. Today, it's $880 billion industry. It's sort of global, but basically it's 15% of the U.S. gross national product. So just stick that in your pipe and smoke it. So death making is changed. Death making is now put directly into the interest of the pharmaceutical capitalism that proves its efficacy in our desire to cure trauma as a psychological event. We are all part of a vast experiment, and particularly in the affluent world of the United States and Europe. And we have produced a culture in which death making is ever more remote, and in a sense, deathness of death has been removed from our consciousness. And so what we get is, you will, sort of a little bit of a type of interesting paradigm now shift taking place, where once sort of the trauma and the deathness has been sort of proposed, right, we, of course, can now heal it. Right? So in some sense it's there, but then it's precisely sort of not there. And of course, 85% of the profits of the pharmaceuticals come from the United States and Europe, but they know where the future lies, right? Because we've already saturated us with our need for functional psychologies within our society. So really, the new emerging market is in the dysfunctional world. So it's to their best interest to basically produce as much dysfunctionality as possible. So I call it, the DNNS, dysfunctional nation-state syndrome. So in other words, in a sinister sort of worldview, you could say that basically pharmaceutical functionalism, right, actually produces and will continue to produce, right, ever more dysfunctional political world in order to enhance the dialectics of death. Thanks.
Next speaker is Professor Erika Naginski, or I have a tendency to pronounce it in Polish way, Naginski. associate professor of architectural history here at Harvard University GSD. Erika has published, of course, I should not take too long to introduce you, Erika, because we are here at home. But definitely, I need to say that a sculpture and enlightenment and polemical objects and also writing on drawing, they're very important books that affected also my own imagination. So thank you for joining us here. I know it's very difficult to speak in your own school, so.
Oh, but it's a pleasure.
Thank you for doing this.
It's a pleasure. I think what's more difficult for me is that where public sculpture and architecture are concerned, I am by training an historian of far older things, and so not someone who works on contemporary artistic cultures with great ease. In other words, I'm far more equipped to think about the kind of violent bodiliness of the Arc de Triomphe than of endless monoliths of Corten steel or the synesthetic effects of liquid, limpid pools, especially if they're commemorative. And so I venture forth with some trepidation. Caveats aside, I thought I would sit a little bit on the aesthetic side of this, another kind of dialectics of death, I guess, but take it from an aesthetic angle, and just reflect briefly on aspects of the tensions between the figurative and the abstract that continually seem to mark our collective commemorative imaginary. Now, I don't know if any of you are readers of the Financial Times. If you had the opportunity to read in the September 2nd issue a piece by the art historian Simon Schama on the 9/11 memorial, which he titled very beautifully, "The Remains of That Day." In the piece, Schama eloquently weaves a discussion of, on the one hand, competing claims of lamentation and instruction on which all memorials can be said to depend, and on the other, of course, something far more intimate, the recounting of a kind of unfathomable personal loss as he searches for Laura. Laura is the sibling of a close friend of his, and he searches for her name among the 2,983 names inscribed on the bronze panels set around the cascading waters of Arad and Walker's reflecting absence. Now, the power of Schama's account, at least to my mind, rests on the way he likewise reflects on absence, on that memorial's ability, to his mind, to represent the unrepresentable, to represent the ruins of that day. Indeed, our collective memory of those ruins radically transforms the parsing of photographs like this one from 1993. This is a precursor to the tragedy of 9/11. It's called Island Within an Island. And here the Mexican artist Gabriela Rosco set wooden boards and kind of urban debris up against a Jersey barrier and in an abandoned parking lot. This to recreate the lower Manhattan skyline, quite prosaically, at least in 1993, punctuated by the Twin Towers. Now, the uncanny prolepsis of such a mirroring, of this doubling effect of the skyline, to my mind, means that this photograph is actually one of the more potent commemorative images we have of the remains of that day. It is significant if we think of that nightmare and its effects on our democracy, that nightmare anticipated here, that Schama's own title takes its cue from two sources. The first, obvious, is Katsuo Ishiguro's novel, The Remains of the Day, in which the failed life filling the thoughts of a dutiful butler coincides with an England haunted by the ruins of empire. The second source, perhaps just as obvious, is what Freud called Rückstände des Tages, or the residues of the day, in which apparently innocent trains of thoughts related to the themes of one's life begin to arouse repressed desires and wishes, leading to displaced images of suppressed memories, and in fact to the overdetermined narratives of dream work. If we want to historicize this, it seems relevant that the Enlightenment, the century that witnessed a philosophy of human rights, the rise of res publica, the public thing, and along with this, the birth of the public monument in the modern sense, could have found its visual eclipse in an etching like Goya's The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. Now, without overstating the collective possibilities of the psychoanalytic analogy, one could propose that the successful memorial, in fact, evokes, represses, and overdetermines all at once. Hence, if the World Trade Center indexes horror in its kind of stratigraphic ghost, and consequently offers visitors a vicarious frisson, a kind of vicarious experience of terror simply by being there in situ, a memorial like reflecting absence there, along with the algorithm that produced the quote-unquote meaningful adjacencies in its arrangement of the names, has the potential to compensate simultaneously. Now, such compensation occurs, according to Shama, because the memorial is a model of, quote, moral tact and poetic indirection. And because it is a commemorative response that he describes as abandoning figuration, quote, for a kind of elemental simplicity, end of quote. Now, the implications of such a statement is that more often than not for us moderns, minimalism has tended to emerge as the only commemorative syntax possible, the only heroic language through which to achieve the requisite moral tact and poetic indirection, the only grammar capable of calibrating repression, empathy, and mourning. And while many a visitor to the Vietnam War Memorial experiences viscerally Maya Lin's ingenious deployment of figuration in abstraction, we tend nonetheless to celebrate its abstraction as such. Or think, too, of the post-structuralist embrace of the conceptual indeterminacies so purposefully evoked by Libeskind, quote, between the lines, as he put it, in the Holocaust Tower Void. Or the sequence of thresholds and passages, that platform, tunnel, and staircase you have here recreating the suicide walk in Caravan's memorial to Walter Benjamin in Portbous, Spain. Because in contradistinction to the vulgarity and quaintness, or the ostensive vulgarity and quaintness of mimesis in obdurate materials, a pared-down approach seems best to echo the citation incised in the glass, chosen from Benjamin's notes on the concept of history. Quote, "It is more arduous to honor the memory of the nameless than that of the renowned. Historical construction is devoted to the memory of the nameless." And yet, figuration haunts the margins of all of this. In the preliminary sketches, the nameless appear as a sequence of stick figures, tumbling midair, limbs akimbo, a kind of desperate animation, slightly cartoonish, of impending passage over the edge. And then towering over Portbous itself and Caravan's elegantly minimalist memorial with all its attendant evocation of the sublime and more complicated, perhaps even Benjamin's fraught relationship to continental philosophy and to Kant. Above Portbous and Caravan's memorial, then, you will find the crest of a mountain pass. and along with that crest, another kind of figurative record, this one made by the Leica cameras of such photographers as Augusti Centelles and Manuel Moros, a record of events at the border crossing to France, through which hundreds of thousands of refugees fled Franco, only to find themselves nearing a coastal town ominously named Cerberus, then sent off to detention camps, promising political persecution, of course, and compromised chances of survival. And simply to conclude, as the historian here, I am struck by how abstraction and figuration have, in truth, always haunted each other's margins. This is the case for the neoclassical sculptor Canova, around 1800 on your left, just as it is the case for someone like Caravan today. That the haunting has a complex history is demonstrated by the manifold ways in which the nameless read abstractions and the heroes read figurations are held in a kind of perpetual dialectics. Now, some have argued that since Vietnam, minimalism has become not only compensatory, but potentially conciliatory, insofar as it works to fold the package of memory into history. Pierre Nora's distinction is still operative here and will not go away. But if minimalism is locked, and I'm turning back to Krzysztof's words at the beginning of this evening, if minimalism, if we can perceive it as somehow still locked in a nostalgic state, one might even want to push the idea that the figurations you see here will always serve as some kind of mnemonic remain, the residue of dream work, and the kind of meaningful detritus that was left behind and that just will not go away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika. I'd like to introduce Kirk Savage. We, not long time ago, met in Washington on the occasion of providing some kind of answer or response, or maybe generating more questions about memorials, invited by National Capital Commission, I'm not sure if that's the right name, and Smithsonian institutions that really are now thinking of temporary monuments, temporary memorials, for various reasons, some of them questionable. So Kirk Savage is coming here from Pittsburgh. He's professor and chair of history of art and architecture. And he's earned PhD in Berkeley, University of California in 1990. He was, before a freelance writer, very much affected by building, by the time of Vietnam War Memorial being built at that time. And then he started to work on monuments, especially those built after and commemorating Civil War, and focusing on slavery and its representation in public monuments, and also the issues of traumatic memory. Now he's working on memorials in Washington, D.C., and on National Mall, and the transformation of memorial landscape. And that was published, a book on 2009 on this issue. And now he's working on memorials in Washington, such as the one by sculpture of Civil War and Reconstruction. Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you very much, Krzysztof. And I'm very conscious of being an out-of-towner here, the only out-of-towner on the panel. I'm also very conscious of having my thoughts be really pretty raw and half-formed at this point. As you'll see in my talk, I went out just a couple of days ago to visit a really important 9/11 site in my neck of the woods, in my region, and I'm still kind of puzzling through my responses to it. But I want to begin by trying to take seriously the charge that Krzysztof gave us to think about democracy and think about the role of the public monument and memorials in democracies. Of course, the track record here isn't particularly good. And we can begin with Washington, D.C., which actually became this incredible space of democratic protest after the mall was cleared in the early mid-20th century. It became the site of really the largest anti-government protests in this nation's history during the Vietnam War. You see some interesting images of that from the early 1970s. But if you walk the mall today, and if you go to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial today, you won't see, you'll hardly see a murmur or hear a murmur about the anti-war movement in the monumental landscape of Washington. And ironically, it's only recently that it's actually sort of burst into, in a small way, into public space in the new Martin Luther King Memorial, which was just opened at the end of August, where there's actually an inscription about, in King's own words, about his opposition to the Vietnam War. It's very near where those protests took place in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So this is the kind of thing that we don't tend to see in Washington. We don't tend to see that cacophony of voices of protest and dissent reflected in our memorial landscape. And it's certainly true of September 11th and what's been happening over the last weekend. The memorial at the World Trade Center here, which I show you, from September 11th, just 2 days ago, when our president visited the site with his predecessor, you see there in the background, and his wife. 9/11, of course, has been the subject of a great deal of dissent and debate in this country, both about its meaning and about the consequences of that event for our nation, for the United States, and also for the rest of the world. And what happens, and what tends to usually happen in a public monument, is that kind of cacophony of voices gets radically simplified, and the monument itself is condensed to something like a list of names, like what we see here. Erika's just been talking about this, and Simon Schama have just been talking about this as an abstraction. And of course, minimalism is the sort of new official language of public monuments since Mylan's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. But both figurative and abstract monuments tend to be radically condensing, radically simplifying forms in which the voices of dissent and debate tend to be excluded, and what's instead created is a kind of sacred space in which unity is on offer and dissent is repressed. We might call it poetic indirection, as Simon Schama did, but it's also very much, I think, an act of collective repression. So I wanted to think about how we could approach the topic of democracy here, and I'm also conscious of being in a room full of designers, and so I want to talk about a specific example. And that is a monument, the monument to September 11th, in which democracy is most often invoked. It's the event in which democracy is most often invoked, and it's the memorial now, I think, where democracy is going to be most often invoked. And this is the Flight 93 Memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So this is a little over an hour from where I live. And I just made a kind of spur-of-the-moment decision on September 11th to go and see the site. Obama was there in the morning, and I made sure that I didn't overlap with him. So I got there a little bit later in the afternoon and looked at the site, and my photographs are from that day. So the flight, of course, Flight 93 has a particular resonance here for us and for the theme of democracy, because this is where the passengers in that plane engaged in an act of, not only an act of resistance against the hijackers who took control of that plane, but in a democratic way, did it in a democratic way, actually came to a vote before they decided to rush the cockpit and try to take control of the plane. And so I wanted to ask myself, as I visited the site, how democracy is represented here in this site, and how it should be represented, or what future, if we begin to take Krzysztof's words, what future does this monument point to? And those are all issues, I think, that are difficult to address, but at least I can put them on the table. So as you enter the memorial site, and I should say this is a huge site. This is a National Park Service site that you literally drive in for 2 or 3 miles in order to get to the site. A lot of the land is owned, I'm not sure exactly what, but a lot of the land is owned by the National Park Service. So it's in effect a national park that is dedicated to this event. When you finally get down to the actual memorial itself, there are these text panels that explain the significance of the site, the attack of 9/11, the response of the passengers on the plane, how they fought back, and as well as depictions of them, their faces and names themselves, so you can come in direct kind of contact with them. And as you go through the site, so this is what you see before you actually enter the monument proper. Then you walk through. Okay. So this is the site from the hillside above, and actually where we were, I don't know if this, do we have a pointer on this? No, probably not. Yeah, we do? Yeah. Where we were back there was right here, where those signs were. That signage was. So the site, as you can see, it's this really beautiful kind of bucolic site. It's actually an old strip mine that's been reclaimed. And you see the farm in the background. So it's almost like again, there's many resonances here. We move from the city in the World Trade Center site to the countryside here. We move to kind of the agrarian origins of our republic and all the mythology that is bound up with that. And to the left of the site is this enormous wind farm, actually, that's been there for quite a while. I took a photograph of that because I thought it's too bad we didn't build more of these, because that event may not have happened if we had done that in the first place. So it's an interesting site. It's and a very beautiful one. What happens at the site is that you, after walking through the entrance plaza, which I'll talk about in just a little bit more, and walking down a very long path, eventually you get to the listing of names, which is now pretty much mandatory, right, in monuments of this kind. And each name of the passenger and the crew member who died there is listed on these really actually very beautiful granite panels, which are somewhere between a little less than a meter wide or something like that. The scale of this solution is really interesting, because again, there's a kind of irony here that the fewer deaths that there are in the event, the more focus there can be on the individuals who are commemorated there, and the more space, literally, that they can have. If we imagine the same design solution at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, for example, it wouldn't work at all, because it would be over 20 miles long. If we imagine the same solution for the non-combatant deaths in Vietnam, we're talking about a wall that's 500 miles long. And so what this does is put enormous pressure, I think, on those names. It puts enormous pressure on them to kind of justify this narrative that we are constructing around them, and this colossal act of commemoration that is not just this enormous, beautiful wall here, but this entire park that's been created around it. So there are two basic narratives about this event, and what I wanted to ask myself was in what ways this memorial design kind of leads to one or the other narrative, or not, or to neither. But the two basic narratives, and again here, the pressure that is put on the individuals who die here is really extraordinary, I think, and the kind of commemorative weight that they have to hold. And you can see the ways in which this was played out in the events that took place over this past weekend there, which were really extraordinary. I mean, they were just as elaborate, if not more so, than the ceremonies that took place at the World Trade Center. You know, Obama came on September 11th itself, but before that, the day before, was the actual dedication of the monument, where we have three administrations represented here: George Bush, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden and his wife, walking by, again, this same series of granite panels. But the two narratives, okay, so one of the narratives is announced at the dedication ceremony. So it's, in a sense, the official narrative of that day from George Bush. So at the moment America's democracy was under attack, our citizens defied their captors by holding a vote. The choice they made would cost them their lives, and they knew it. With their selfless act, the men and women who stormed the cockpit lived out the words, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man may lay down his life for his friends." And with their brave decision, they launched the first counteroffensive of the War on Terror. So this is quite obviously, you know, a narrative that is meant to legitimate George Bush's administration's own War on Terror. It turns the monument, in effect, into the very first war memorial of the global War on Terror. And it's an interesting speech, and we can point to the ways in which I think retrospectively Bush is very much changing the narrative of that day and what happened on that plane. And this is not in any way to diminish the bravery and presence of mind of those passengers, which was truly extraordinary, and what they did that day. But we do know from the conversations that were taking place between them and their loved ones on the phone that this was not a choice they made that really cost them their lives. They knew they were going to die. If they didn't do anything, they would die. And one of the reasons that they did, in fact, storm the cockpit is that it was the only chance that they had to survive that flight. But by putting this entirely into the language of selflessness and sacrifice, of course, it's absorbing the event into a narrative of military valor and sacrifice that is very, very familiar to us from traditional war memorials. Right, so there is another narrative, and it actually has been outlined by a professor right here at your institution at Harvard over in the English department, Elaine Scarry, who wrote a really interesting paper in 2002 on this act of self-defense that the passengers engaged in. And basically her argument was that the Department of Defense failed us on that day, September 11th, did not defend the country. And the only people who did successfully defend the country on that day were the passengers in this plane. She compares the trajectories of Flight 77, which hit the Pentagon, and Flight 93, which was overtaken by the passengers, and says that they could do, you know, the military was essentially helpless and powerless in trying to prevent the attack on the Pentagon. And this is despite the fact that the official doctrine of the military for a long time has been that in the case of a nuclear strike, that we could respond within minutes to a missile coming in from outside our borders. And so she really demolishes that entire argument and shows how, you know, despite the fact that they had actually somewhere between 25 minutes, maybe an hour to respond, weren't able to. And so for her, it's a story about how the authoritarian, top-down military-industrial complex did not succeed, but in fact a ground-up kind of civil citizen soldier kind of defense actually worked. Now the question of whether, I think there's complexities and difficulties with both of these narratives, both the Bush narrative and the Scary narrative, but it's interesting the way in which they're so diametrically opposed. And I wondered when I was at the site, looking at the people who were there and photographing and experiencing it, kind of how they were processing it. For example, the Harley-Davidson guy here, there were hundreds of bikers at the site, maybe thousands, I don't know. I saw hundreds, literally hundreds of them. The site itself has become a kind of iconic place for the biker kind of culture here. And you see it's this place where ordinary Americans rose up in defense of their country. Now, whether he would align himself with the militaristic narrative or the radical anti-militaristic narrative of Scary, I don't have any idea, except he does, in fact, there is also a message about the troops here as well. But clearly, it's something that probably in a way appeals to both narratives, may have some appeal to someone like this. And the question that I wanted to ask myself was whether the design itself, and I'm talking to designers, whether the design itself kind of leads or points in one direction or the other. And as I thought more and more about the design, I was more troubled by certain aspects of it. The basic logic of the design is that it's essentially a kind of perimeter defense. There's a wall here, which you see, a low angle black wall, which you see that goes all around the site and keeps the public on one side in this hardscape plaza and keeps them out of the field on the other side. The reason for that is that the field is the crash site. It's where the plane went down. And we're not allowed there. We're not allowed in that field. The public is not allowed there. And in fact, when we come to the end of that black wall, to the white wall where the list of names is located, there is this gate you see here over on the right side of your image. And this, in a way, is the kind of most extraordinary part of the design, I think, for me. It's actually really beautiful, this kind of rough-hewn wooden gate. It looks a little bit like a Flintstones gate in the photographs, but it really is actually a very beautiful thing. And what it is the gate that keeps us out of the walkway to the crash site. And the only people allowed through that gate are the family members or very important people, or family members of the deceased are allowed through that gate to go to the crash site. So you see here the path leading up to the boulder, which actually marks the exact spot where the plane hit the ground. There was a big crater there at the time, of course, which has been filled in, replaced with a boulder, planted with wildflowers. It was a beautiful time to go see it because this goldenrod is in bloom, which is in bloom everywhere in western Pennsylvania at this period of time. So the site's been altered, of course, but put into a kind of a pastoral, very much of a pastoral frame. And it is, in a sense, doubly sacred. I started by talking about the World Trade Center site as a kind of sacred space where, dissent and debate are not really permitted. But this is doubly sacred because it's also where the remains of the people who died are located, because when the plane hit the ground, it incinerated, and so it was only possible to recover a very small percentage of the remains of the victims from that plane. And most of those remains are still out there in this field. And that has been the rationale for why the general public isn't allowed out there. So it's only, people, of course, President Obama and his wife walked out there when they visited on September 11th, just 2 days ago. But for the rest of us, we stay behind the gate. And this is very different from, for me, it was really striking because it seemed to me absolutely unprecedented. I couldn't think of anything like it here in the United States. It's particularly when we think of this as a National Park Service site. And the exclusion of the public from that plot of ground. It's very different from Gettysburg, where I just was, at the end of August, this kind of open field. Many, many, many thousands of people died on this spot where I took this photograph. And their remains are, some of them were exhumed, but a lot of the remains are still presumably under there. It's different from the whole ethos of the military cemetery in Arlington or in the military cemeteries abroad in Europe, like in Normandy, which are top-down. Scary, I think, would acknowledge that these are top-down expressions of the military, where they do, in fact, very much visually take the ordinary person. They're a kind of visual expression of the way in which ordinary men were compelled to serve for their country, and they're put into a radically egalitarian framework with exactly the same image for each one. But this is an accessible place, a place where people come and walk among the graves. So in some sense, the design vocabulary is a little bit similar in a way to the wall at the Shanksville Memorial, but the implications are very different of that, of the accessibility of the site. And so this led me to think more about, again, questions of democratic accessibility and debate that would take place at sites like this, where the public now is almost completely excluded now from the, or is very much herded into a particular location here in the memorial site. And for me, the gate itself, in a way, stood as the kind of emblem for me of the experience that I had there. All right, I had one more picture, yeah. And as you see there, if you go to the site, you'll see people crowding in at the gate, putting their point and shoots in between the wooden beams there and shooting the boulder in the background. And I think this is for me, it was a very resonant image that raises a lot of questions related to democracy that maybe we can pick up in the aftermath. Okay.
My role here is to be a moderator. Is it
On.
Is it working? So my my role is to be a moderator, which is a very foreign position in my life. I've been moderated before, but not moderating, nor that I am moderate. My work is actually more of a provocative, has a provocative mission and character. But let me ask first you, Mark, about the afterlife of monuments. where there is also about monuments in general, because it looks like your presentation didn't touch upon the monument itself.
Yeah, I think this on too. I don't know. I just speak a little louder. Well, I was trying to ask, I guess, if all monuments are operative, whether they're, whether we agree with the way they operate or not, is the new concept of death that we have basically forcing us to sort of rethink how our monuments operate. So we have to sort of, work our way through or from below from the question of death rather than from the event horizon that monuments ask us to first inhabit. Right? So, but plane crashes, we have to make a design. Whereas I'm saying that basically the plane crashing, making a design is sort of comes, that's step 10, or maybe even step 100 after already sort of a cultural familiarization and rethinking about the whole question of death that has nothing to do with the actual historical event, right? So the monument sort of focuses in an overdetermined way, as I think Erika talked about, on sort of the historicity as such, right? And so I was pointing to this other history, which is sort of the history in which there is no there, right? We've already assimilated terror into our culture, and so as a consequence, maybe the monuments themselves become sort of strangely ineffective now, right? Because we don't see or recognize our own mortality in the sort of production of our not deathly deathness.
Trauma industry.
Yeah, the trauma industry is a big part of that, and I think it's just not, I mean, I'm not trying to point the finger only at them, but I think we have accepted that, right? I mean, we've bought into it, and the consequences also is we buy into, in some sense, the desire to rehearse the sort of sublime exaggerations, right? So if 9/11, the Life magazine comes out with, the new history of America, right? In other words, it takes 9/11 for us to sort of find America, right? So, politicians now say, okay, let's recreate death at every political junction to find America, right? And so therefore we wind in this bizarre, so I find a lot of the bizarre right-wing, politics of today basically re-inhabiting sort of the 9/11 success of 9/11. Right, not its failure. I mean, it's all succeeded all too well, and that's really the monument that's out there.
It's interesting, Mark, because the trauma industry that we know in the modern period also has a kind of complicated historiography. It's arguable, there's no real word trauma, I guess, in the early modern period. This is a modern concept, but one of the first instances, at least in my neck of the woods, was the execution of Louis XVI in the French Revolution. And either this was an event celebrated or an event that actually caused Kant to lose his capacity to philosophize in an extended footnote. But the point is that afterwards, that trauma got coded by Kant and others as a kind of original sin. And it emerged in the language of monuments, so that by the time we get to the early 19th century, you see churches like the Magdalene Church, which rehearses in its pediment the collective sin based on the traumas of history. So I think trauma itself, we might associate it with a capitalist, post-humanist, American obsession with death. But it's interesting also to track back and to think about the battles between democracies and monarchies, or officials and collectives, and think about that history as having a kind of complex articulation.
What is the origin or history of the term nameless, the nameless, Erika?
Oh my goodness, I don't know if I can talk about the history, or the etymology. I think, though, that the notion that you could have a monument to the nameless or to a public does emerge in the 18th century. One of the first images of the people is, which replaces the image of kingship, is, after all, Hercules. And it's a fraught image, because Hercules is a kind of brutish hero, all brawn and no brains, as it were, and yet it emerged as an image of the people during the French Revolution. You have other articulations. In a little bit later, a kind of naturalist by the name of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre is going to describe an Elysium in the late 18th century where he describes a monument to the common laborer. This is one of the first instances I know of a kind of image of a collective or an anonymous kind of class-based personhood, as it were. And I think it's a question of how personhood is constituted, right? This relates
Because
to
I'm
notions of democracy.
thinking about the nameless, especially after Kirk Savage's reference to the non-combatants. Thinking that, how about Iraqi civilians? How about 80% of traumatized children in Iraq? How about people bombed in Afghanistan? How about the victims or survivors of Homeland Security mistakes and overreaction after, in the aftermath of September 11, and many other nameless who may be considered as important, I don't want to say heroes, but definitely people who should be included in a memorial. If the memorial waited that long, and maybe for good reason, to allow us to sort out to some degree what happened, perhaps that inclusion would be an act of bravery against exclusion in history of memorials. But how about aftermath of afterlife? Rather of memorials. I will then shift this question to Kirk.
Right. Well, it's something. I mean, I've thought, been thinking a lot about the obsolescence of memorials and war memorials, and this gets back to the naming issue. There's this initially an incredible power in naming who you name and who you don't name. What categories of people deserve to be named on a monument? What categories of people don't deserve to be named on a monument, and it's almost an obsession. In the late 19th and beginning of the late 19th century, one of the first questions that I asked myself after September 11th is why even people thought that the names of the victims deserved to be named, why those names deserved to be etched into stone, because in an earlier time they wouldn't have been. So we have on the one hand this incredible power, and they seem to, and when you look at the rhetoric that emerges, say, after the Civil War in the United States, the idea is, you see this, all you have to do is walk across the street to Memorial Hall, all right, and look at the panels and the names. The idea was you put the name in stone, and it's going to live forever. So it's this enormous power that is given to the name. When in fact what happens is that those names disappear, and they begin to lose their power as the, people who knew those names begin to disappear. So this is one of the basic facts about one of the basic issues to contend with in the afterlife of memorials, and particularly war memorials, is that that sort of all-encompassing power that people thought names had to kind of perpetuate themselves forever drains away after a few, not too long actually. It begins to drain away within a few years. And we see that happening at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial right now, which is one of the rationales for why a Vietnam Veterans Memorial visitor center is being planned and maybe one day be built. Because literally, they have said the names have become anonymous. The names have become anonymous. The names on the wall are becoming anonymous. An oxymoron, right? But this is part of the rationale. So the monument slides into obsolescence. What happens then? And how is its power maintained, or should its power be maintained even? What should Philip Kennicott in the Washington Post recommended in in a kind of editorial piece, he said, let's take down monuments as they become obsolete. Let's take them down and return the sites to the way that they used to be before. So that's one response to this. But I wonder about, particularly with the memorials that we've been talking about that have just been dedicated over this past weekend, and this idea of the sacred ground at Shanksville. Eventually, the family members are going to start to die off, and the kin networks are going to dissolve that are connected to that boulder. And at some point, I think, that site will probably be open.
So this is an issue of design.
Right.
Of the kind of vision, the future of those memorial sites, how much we can create, to what degree, conditions so they could be useful sites of some discursive, maybe agonistic memory, in which the contesting memories and also interpretations and some kind of continuing discourse on memory could be inspired and achieve the kind of density that they will be no longer, they will be prevented from becoming homeless of history, as Alois Riegel would call it. But perhaps we should now give a chance for people who generously stay that long, because it's already close to 8, to voice some questions, ideas, and share some thoughts on the issue of memorial.
And as someone thinks of a question, I just, when you broached the question of access, of public access, I remember years ago ferreting around in archives in Paris and finding a whole description of precisely this problem, of the distance of barriers from monuments or executions, of how you calibrate vision over and against entrance and participation. So there is a kind of interesting, I think that the issue is that you have to recognize that there's a public to be controlled, which is precisely what happens in the 18th century. And then an official bureaucracy steps in to calibrate that access.
Somebody.
Hi, thank you very much. Professor Jarzombek, I particularly liked your pharmaceutical advertisement you showed where what was exactly, what's behind that smile, ask your doctor about treating depression. And I can't help but think of monuments as something that also sort of is very much like that. It's something that embodies fear in and of themselves, and that they can be a prescription for emotion in terms of how we should respond to them and respond to life. And I was wondering what your response would be about that in terms of the embodiment of fear in monuments and the prescription for how we should treat that.
That's a good question. I mean, I would say like, yeah, let's go and get a beer and talk about it. Yeah, I think, certainly the monuments that we attempt to 9/11, right, they have to ratchet up the premise of the historical fact and the fear that underlays that, right? And I think these types of monuments, and even though, I guess you can question whether the one in New York is state-sponsored monument, but it's quasi-state-sponsored. I mean, both are basically national monuments, and national monuments basically will evoke certain types of tropes of historical damage, right? Someone did something to us, right? And this is sort of a new type of monument in the American world, right? I mean, you go to other places, you go to Russia, and there's the monument about the Nazis, and I can't remember the day in which everyone goes out there, and it's a huge and impressive thing. I mean, and many countries around the world have their monument in which some nasty invader came and did off with a couple thousand people or whatever, right? So, this is much more common in other places, right, than in the United States, where we haven't been invaded, so we never have a monument to someone who's attacked us, right? So this is a whole new sort of phenomenon, right? that that we're sort of struggling to sort of identify, right? So it's not just some distant, remote war in Asia or somewhere, right? So I think in that sense there's a certain sort of novelty about what it is that you do for that, right? That I think is good for the Americans to experience, the being the attacked rather than sort of just the heroes returning, from some distant, war around the horizon. And fear is going to be a big part, certainly, of these monuments, forever and ever, And I think, I mean, I think that's sort of too bad, because the fear will always sort of be reconstituted in, if we do the Le Carre's, acting out process, right? So, basically for the last 10 years, we've been acting out. We're not working through it at all. Right? The only way we've been working through it, is sort of through the sublimated, text of the pharmaceutical industry, right?
So, just to cite kind of reference, Robert Filiu, Fluxus artist, he proposed a project for exchange of war memorials between adjacent countries. So I think that you agree would be one of the ways.
Well, I think one of the part of the design logic now is the creation of a kind of emotional journey that's supposed to be healing in some way, and it's a little hard to see, this, again, Mylan's Memorial is the prototype here at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's a little hard to see how that works at the World Trade Center sites. It'll be interesting to see how that works or to what extent it does. At the Shanksville site, I see there's a kind of procession, and you go through, you encounter the trauma at the beginning, you go through the pavilion, you walk down a long walk, you come to that gate, you peer at the crash site and the boulder, and then you hit the wall with the names, and you walk along the wall and you see all the offerings at the wall, and I think it's supposed to be a kind of cathartic experience, whether it in fact functions in that way or not, and where you go after that. In the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, you kind of reintegrate into the mall. You have to kind of retrace your steps in the Shanksville project. I think there's a little bit of a problem there, but it's but that whole concept of a kind of journey, and it's a scripted experience. I mean, I would think this is very different from Krzysztof's work, where we're encountering testimony of people, and it's unpredictable how we're going to respond, or here it's more of an idea of a scripted experience to deal with that underlying fear, that we experienced.
Any other questions, thoughts, and ideas?
Anybody want to talk about abstraction?
The new stations of the cross.
I just want to propose talking about the spontaneous memorials of the people. It came to my mind when in Spain, in Madrid, we have that there's the March 11, and after these attacks of the trains, the people spontaneously came to the stations and put lights and papers and write things for the families. So I don't know if there's more experiences about it, but I would like to bring it here, just to mention it and maybe to suggest talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredibly important reference. In New York, and I happened to be there, the whole Manhattan was in fact turned into one spontaneous memorial, extremely discursive. The way that no memorials built can offer, at least have not offered so far. Here, people were exchanging freely their interpretation of the event, and mostly very much against any revengeous tendencies, meaning acting out, more into really mourning as Freud would call it, but some also were kind of chauvinistic too. So there was a response. There was a continuing exchange, truly an agonistic memory, if I could use Chantal Mouffe concept for memory. Even one interesting slogan, they were all written on the ground, so didn't survive. They were written on the surfaces of the city, not only as posters, was saying, there is a terrorist inside of each of us. Which is interesting, kind of provocative statements. So it's that kind of commemorative, really mourning process was disrupted by George Bush's arrival, who basically told us that you should stop this. Well, there were delegation to Afghanistan of families of those who were killed trying to negotiate peace. So in that time, he basically said, no, this is a national defense issue. This is my business. This is Washington. This is White House business. It's not New York. And there was a banner in front of a place where I live, which says, which said, U.S. out of Manhattan. So those are the really spontaneous, part of a spontaneous memorial.
You know, this has become ritualized now. The so-called spontaneous memorials become ritualized at these sites. It's already built into the design of the Shanksville Memorial that this is going to happen. There's going to be spontaneous offerings at the wall. There are some niches built into the black wall that you walk along that are built there so for people to deposit these things, you know, flags and T-shirts and teddy bears and whatever. And so it's really interesting how that has happened, how that kind of agonistic public space that Krzysztof just described so eloquently becomes then a kind of ritualized sort of pro forma part of the design of the memorial experience. And all that stuff now gets archived. Every single thing that's left at the Shanksville site is archived. And they have to now then make these decisions. How are we going to keep everything, 100% of this? You know, and they're talking in very practical terms, like how many, do we really want 1,000 Beanie Babies? Or maybe we can just keep one as an example. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that they literally have to deal with there, that the you know, keepers of the site, the curators of the site have to deal with.
Yes, but it's possible to imagine design that will be more inspiring and dynamic with the use of responsive environment or interactive media, something that some of us here could probably propose.
There's a uniquely American sort of pop phenomena of death, right? Where the teddy bears and the flags and the bean babies, you know, or somehow deposited, you know, around on various spots, you know, and that has come up in the last 10 years roughly. I mean, I would say, I mean, when we were growing up, you know, if some student, you know, died on the football field, that was just tough luck. I mean, you know, now there'll be, you know, candle vigils and this whole sort of, you know, process of, you know, sort of Greek tragedy, you know, presenting itself. So, you know, and these memorials get sort of caught up in that, right? They sort of produce it, and then they're the victims of this sort of vomit of schlock, right? That gets produced by this stuff, right? Because they're completely all meaningless, right? You go to the store, you buy a teddy bear, and then you put it there, and then that's done.
Any attempt to think and analyze the events, the meaning, and what was behind them is, in case of terrorist attack like this, can be immediately confused with apology and justification. So that's one big problem, how to think without being accused of justification.
A point that and I'll shut up after this, but a point that it raises in my mind here is that the way in which we kind of get invested in these objects that are deposited there, when in fact at the site there were all kinds of conversations going on. There was a discourse going on, but it's not recorded, it's not archived, it's not encourage, there's nothing about the design that really encourages it, or that, so the ways in which, Krzysztof, you just mentioned, if we could think as designers about ways of encouraging that discourse and getting people to interact, to actually, to think about how we might preserve that kind of discourse rather than putting all our energy into the objects that then become the kind of deposit of the memorial experience, are these objects that are curated, that are left, in a museum somewhere, and not this really lively kind of democratic discourse that actually is going on in some cases there.
Maybe the last.
Well, I hope someone will want to talk about, because one of the things that really interested about Kirk's presentation and Erika's is the question of minimalism. This gets right, I think, very close to our architectural world, And, I think minimalism which is sort of now basically the cult of, basically architectural discourse today, is under huge stress, right? Because now it's a state-sponsored aesthetic. It's not the Maya Lin, slightly counterculture, wow, how did she do that type of thing. It's like, oh, everybody does it now. Governments all want their minimalist things, and this is not, you can go around the world practically and find this place. So, I think, pretty soon, architects are going to wake up and realize every time they design some minimalist thing, basically you can call it a Holocaust memorial. I did a little complete, I shouldn't say this, but I just was in Israel last year. I went around and I photographed every odd, thing that I saw, that looked like it could be a Holocaust memorial, right? But of course it wasn't. It was just, a piece of concrete that had been left over, from a construction site, or chairs placed around a table, but one chair was a little weird, and I photographed that, right? And then you could just begin around, and you could just, almost everything becomes a Holocaust memorial, right? If it's just a little strange, a little weird, a little minimalist, right, So, we're so used now to the project of producing these minimalist things that ultimately, it becomes its own, it's met a wall of saturation that it just is not going to be able to survive much longer. We'll go back to statues, and I think the Martin Luther King is already a symptom of the return of the figural. We're sort of sick and tired of looking at minimalist things and trying to figure them out.
But both are monoliths. Both monolithical.
Yeah.
Whether it's figurative or abstract.
So I think it's, as an architect, we should be really frightened. Because, minimalism is what we do.
Do you think that a digital memorial that travels would be a good memorial?
Could be.
That's not tied to a place, or maybe tied to a specific kind of memorial, but it can change, can be curated
The
differently.
AIDS quilt, right? AIDS quilt might be an example of this.
Well, I guess there are memorials like this online. There is lots of discursive networks. People share the memories, and they may argue. But it's not, of course, the same, since they are somehow isolated. It's not the same situation like combining it with a physical public space. But it's possible to create something that will combine both. Well, I think maybe it's time for us to complete this session. Thank you for staying that long. And